The enemy is advancing. We must hold this position at all costs.
Understood, sir. My men are ready.
Good. Move out. Gentlemen, the operation begins at dawn. Precision is critical.
Understood, sir. All units are prepared.
Good. Coordinate with the flanks.
August 1944. The German army is crumbling. Victory in Europe seems weeks away. Then Patton's tanks, the fastest in military history, suddenly run dry. Not from German resistance, but from a decision made 200 miles behind the lines. While Patton's Third Army sits motionless outside Metz, fuel trucks roll north to Montgomery's forces. Patton explodes. The best damn general the British have got. But what did Montgomery actually say when he learned Patton was secretly hoarding fuel, defying direct orders, and racing him to Berlin? The truth is far more explosive than Hollywood ever showed you. This is the story of the greatest rivalry in World War II, and the controversial decision that may have extended the war by 7 months. In late August 1944, the Allied advance across France had transformed into something resembling a chase more than a battle.
Gentlemen, the operation commences at dawn. Precision is paramount. There is no margin for error.
The situation is critical. We must act now. Yes, sir. Understood.
Move out.
Patton's Third Army, unleashed on August 1st after being sidelined since the Sicily slapping incidents, was tearing through German positions at breathtaking speed. His tanks covered 400 miles in just 2 weeks, capturing Le Mans on August 8th and wheeling north to trap 2 entire German armies in the Falaise pocket. The Germans were on the verge of total collapse. Their 7th and 5th Panzer armies were being systematically destroyed. Intelligence reports confirmed what every Allied commander could see. German resistance in France was finished. All that remained was the final push into the Reich itself. The only question was, who would get there first? Montgomery's 21st Army Group was pushing north through Belgium toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart.
The situation is escalating. We must be prepared. Understood. What are your orders? Hold the line. Reinforcements are en route. Yes, sir.
His Second Army had just liberated Brussels on September 4th, and his forces captured the vital port of Antwerp the same day. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was racing eastward, aiming to cross the Rhine at Mainz and Mannheim, deep in southern Germany. Bradley's First Army held the center, approaching the German border near Aachen. But there was a critical problem that neither Hollywood films nor glory-seeking generals wanted to acknowledge: logistics. The Allied supply lines stretched back more than 400 miles to the Normandy beaches. The critical port at Cherbourg was operating, but it couldn't handle the massive fuel requirements of 3 entire army groups simultaneously. The French railway system lay in ruins, systematically destroyed by Allied bombing before D-Day. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every K-ration had to be trucked forward in an enormous convoy system called the Red Ball Express. By late August, the mathematics of modern warfare were catching up with the speed of the advance. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He couldn't support both Montgomery's northern thrust and Patton's eastern drive. One would have to wait. The Supreme Commander initially favored the broad front strategy, advancing everywhere simultaneously to keep pressure on the Germans across the entire line. But both Montgomery and Patton were independently lobbying for a single, concentrated thrust that would smash through to Berlin before winter. Montgomery argued his case on August 23rd at a meeting with Eisenhower. He proposed a full-blooded thrust north through Holland, across the Rhine, and into the Ruhr. Success would require 40 divisions, including 12 American divisions from Bradley's command, and virtually all available supplies. The plan was audacious. Montgomery believed it could end the war by Christmas 1944. Patton, meanwhile, presented his own vision to Bradley. His Third Army would drive through the Saar, bypass the fortified Metz, leap the Rhine near Frankfurt, and strike directly into the heart of Germany from the south. His argument was simple, and typically Patton: "I'm already there. Just give me the gas." The stage was set for the most consequential decision of the European campaign. George Patton had spent his entire military career preparing for this moment. The grandson of a Confederate colonel killed at Winchester, heir to California wealth, Olympic pentathlete, and America's foremost tank warfare theorist, Patton saw himself as a warrior poet destined for greatness. And he wasn't about to let logistics, or Eisenhower's diplomatic caution, stop him from claiming his place in history. On August 31st, 1944, Patton's Third Army ground to a halt near the Moselle River, just outside the fortress city of Metz. The official reason: fuel exhaustion. Third Army had been allocated just 32,000 gallons of gasoline, barely enough to move a single division. Patton had requested 400,000 gallons. His tanks, his trucks, his entire mechanized force sat immobilized within striking distance of the German border. But Patton wasn't the type of general to accept orders he considered foolish. What happened next would become one of the most controversial episodes of the entire war, and one that military historians still debate today. Patton began employing what he called his rock soup method of warfare. In the old folk tale, a hungry traveler convinces suspicious villagers to contribute ingredients to his magic stone soup, gradually building a feast from nothing. Patton's version was more cunning. He systematically misrepresented his actual supply situation to SHAEF headquarters. When inspectors came forward, Patton allegedly had his personal jeep arrive nearly empty of fuel to demonstrate the desperate situation, then refueled it at Bradley's 12th Army Group motor pool. Simultaneously, Patton was secretly hoarding fuel wherever he could find it. His staff requisitioned supplies meant for other units. They discovered forgotten fuel dumps. In one notorious incident, 3rd Army units simply seized gasoline shipments intended for Hodges's 1st Army. When confronted, Patton's chief of staff would apologize profusely while promising immediate corrective action that never quite materialized. Patton also kept moving, even when ordered to halt. He employed brilliant semantic gymnastics. He wasn't advancing, he was conducting reconnaissance in force. His divisions weren't attacking, they were securing defensible positions. By the time Schaff realized what was happening, Patton had crossed the Moselle and was besieging Metz, in direct violation of his orders to hold in place. This deception created massive confusion at Schaff. Supreme Headquarters couldn't accurately assess which armies actually needed supplies because Patton's reports bore little resemblance to reality. His underhand methods didn't just affect his own operations, they potentially compromised the entire Allied supply system. But Patton saw it differently. He believed he was on the verge of the breakthrough that would end the war. In his mind, Eisenhower's caution and Montgomery's demands were costing American lives. His private diary and letters reveal his increasingly paranoid conviction that there was a conspiracy to stop him. He told staff officers they now had 2 enemies, the Germans and Schaff. Most explosively, Patton believed Eisenhower was deliberately starving his army to appease Montgomery and maintain Allied unity. In one angry outburst to his staff, Patton reportedly said Eisenhower was the best damn general the British have got. The comment, whether he actually said it or not, perfectly captured the toxic atmosphere developing between the American commanders and their British counterparts. Bernard Law Montgomery was everything Patton was not: methodical, cautious, and politically astute. The hero of El Alamein had defeated Rommel in the desert, commanded Allied ground forces on D-Day, and now led the British 21st Army Group toward what he believed would be the war's decisive objective, the industrial Ruhr Valley. But Montgomery also faced enormous pressure that Patton didn't fully comprehend. Britain's military strength was exhausted. The island nation had been at war since 1939, 2 years longer than America. British manpower reserves were depleted to the point where units were being disbanded to provide replacements for others. The British economy was on the verge of bankruptcy. Churchill's government needed a quick victory in 1944, not a grinding campaign into 1945. Politically, Montgomery also represented British prestige in what was rapidly becoming an overwhelmingly American war. By September 1944, American forces outnumbered British troops by more than 3-1. Montgomery wasn't just fighting Germans, he was fighting for Britain's voice at the peace table. A British-led thrust to Berlin would achieve both military and political objectives simultaneously. When Eisenhower met with Montgomery on September 5th, the British Field Marshal pressed his case with characteristic intensity. Eisenhower had initially approved giving Montgomery supply priority for a bold airborne operation, what would become Operation Market Garden. The plan called for dropping 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges across the Rhine at Arnhem, opening a corridor for British armor to pour into northern Germany. Montgomery's intelligence staff had assured him that German forces in Holland were weak, demoralized, and likely to collapse. The plan was audacious, risky, and exactly the kind of war-winning stroke that could vindicate the British contribution to victory. If successful, British tanks would be across the Rhine and heading for Berlin while Patton was still besieging Metz. This was the context for the fuel allocation decision that enraged Patton. Starting in early September, supply priority shifted dramatically northward. Montgomery's 21st Army Group received approximately 1,400 tons of supplies daily. Bradley's 1st Army received roughly 5,000 tons. Patton's 3rd Army? A mere 2,000 tons. Barely enough to sustain defensive operations, let alone the offensive Patton demanded. What did Montgomery actually say when he learned about Patton's fuel hoarding and insubordination? The historical record is frustratingly sparse. Montgomery's official communications remained professionally correct. He never publicly criticized Patton by name, but his private assessment, shared with Chief of Staff General Francis de Guingin, was devastating in its professional coldness. The American general was temperamentally unsuited for high command and prone to impulsive movements that endangered the overall Allied position. More tellingly, Montgomery's intelligence chief, Brigadier E.T. Williams, later revealed in interviews that Montgomery had explicitly requested Bradley halt Patton's advance at Argentan during the Falaise battle in mid-August. Montgomery reportedly feared Patton's uncontrolled dash would either lead to friendly fire incidents with Canadian forces or allow the trapped Germans to escape eastward. When Bradley complied, stopping Patton on August 13th, it set the template for what would happen again in September. Montgomery's assessment of Patton was clinical: brilliant tactician, terrible strategist, impossible to control. The British Field Marshal believed Patton's race to glory would fragment Allied strength at the precise moment when concentration of force could win the war. Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible situation. As Supreme Allied Commander, his primary responsibility wasn't just defeating Germany. It was holding together an alliance of nations with divergent interests, personalities, and strategic visions. And in September 1944, that alliance was fracturing over fuel allocations and personal rivalries. Eisenhower's background made him uniquely suited for this diplomatic nightmare. Unlike Patton or Montgomery, he'd never commanded troops in combat during World War I. His entire career had been built on staff work, planning, and political navigation. Critics called him a chair-born general. Supporters recognized him as possibly the only American officer capable of managing Montgomery's ego and Patton's ambition simultaneously. The Supreme Commander had initially decided on the broad front strategy for sound military reasons. A single concentrated thrust, whether Montgomery's or Patton's, would have to abandon flank protection over hundreds of miles. A breakthrough force racing deep into Germany would be vulnerable to counterattack. The Allies had seen what happened when German forces overextended themselves during the Battle of France in 1940. Temporary success followed by logistical collapse. But Eisenhower also recognized a deeper truth that his subordinate commanders didn't want to acknowledge. Even with fuel, neither Montgomery nor Patton could have reached Berlin in 1944. The German army was battered, but not broken. The Siegfried Line fortifications still protected Germany's borders. And the Allies simply didn't have the logistical infrastructure to support a sustained offensive 400 miles beyond their supply bases. Nevertheless, Eisenhower was under enormous pressure to choose. The British government was pushing hard for Montgomery's northern strategy. Churchill himself had become involved, pressing Eisenhower through military and diplomatic channels. The Americans, particularly Patton and Bradley, were furious at what they perceived as favoritism toward the British. On September 5th, Eisenhower relented. He authorized Montgomery's Market Garden operation and allocated the supplies to support it. In practical terms, this meant Patton's Third Army would be effectively frozen in place. The official explanation was operational necessity. The northern route offered better objectives and shorter supply lines. The unstated reality was political calculation. Eisenhower needed to maintain Allied unity, and that meant occasionally deferring to British demands. Patton's reaction was volcanic. He confronted Bradley, who sympathized but supported Eisenhower's decision. Patton allegedly threatened resignation, though he never formally submitted it. His diary entries from this period are filled with barely contained rage. He accused Eisenhower of cowardice, of sacrificing American lives for British glory, of potentially extending the war by months or years. The most damaging accusation came later, that Eisenhower's decision allowed the Germans to regroup, fortify their positions, and eventually launch the devastating counteroffensive that became the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Patton believed, and many military historians have debated, that if Third Army had been fully supplied in September, it could have crossed the Rhine before the Germans recovered, potentially ending the war months earlier. Eisenhower defended his decision for the rest of his life. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, he acknowledged the controversy, but insisted the broad front strategy was militarily sound and politically necessary. The Supreme Commander also pointed out something Patton conveniently ignored. By mid-September, according to official records, the critical fuel shortage had ended. Third Army's railheads were functioning, and supply levels were adequate for sustained operations. The historical debate continues. Would Patton's thrust have succeeded if fully supported? Could Montgomery's market garden have worked with better planning? Or was Eisenhower right that neither could have achieved decisive victory in 1944? The answers remain contested among military historians today. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944, with the largest airborne assault in history. British and American paratroopers dropped across Holland to seize bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Montgomery's ground forces, led by XXX Corps, would race up the corridor, cross the Rhine, and break into Germany's industrial heartland. The plan called for the operation to be completed in 3 days. It was a disaster. German resistance, far from being weak and demoralized, was fierce and well organized. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem found itself fighting against 2 SS Panzer divisions that happened to be refitting in the area, divisions that Allied intelligence had somehow missed. After 9 days of brutal combat, the surviving British paratroopers were evacuated across the Rhine. Of the 10,000 men who dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,400 made it back. The failure of Market Garden vindicated every criticism Patton had made about Montgomery's cautious tactics and flawed intelligence. Patton's supporters argue that the fuel and supplies wasted on Montgomery's failed offensive could have maintained Third Army's momentum, potentially crossing the Rhine in the south while German attention was focused on Holland. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army remained largely static through September and October. When offensive operations resumed in November, the easy victories of August were gone. German forces had used the breathing space to strengthen the Siegfried Line defenses. What should have been a rapid advance became a grinding battle of attrition. The fortress city of Metz, which Patton had planned to bypass in August, required a 3-month siege before finally falling in late November. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented the ultimate consequence of the September decisions. The Germans had time to regroup, plan, and launch a massive counteroffensive that caught the Allies completely by surprise. Ironically, it was Patton who emerged as the hero of the Bulge, rapidly pivoting Third Army 90 degrees north and relieving the encircled Americans at Bastogne. Precisely the kind of aggressive, mobile warfare he'd been prevented from conducting in September. What did Montgomery say in his post-war memoirs about the fuel controversy and Patton's actions? His 1958 memoir is remarkably restrained. Montgomery acknowledged the great argument over strategy, but defended his northern thrust as the correct operational choice. He never directly criticized Patton, maintaining professional courtesy even in retirement. But his assessment was clear. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was flawed, but Patton's alternative would have been reckless and unsustainable. The legacy of September 1944 remains contentious. Brigadier General Albin Erzik, who served as a tank battalion commander under Patton, later wrote an entire book arguing that the war would have ended in 1944 if Patton had received adequate fuel. Other historians point out that such counterfactuals ignore German defensive capabilities, Allied logistical limitations, and the already agreed-upon occupation zones that would have given the Soviets Eastern Germany, regardless of who reached Berlin first. What's undeniable is that the decision to prioritize Montgomery over Patton in September 1944 fundamentally shaped the final 9 months of World War II in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. The continued war into 1945 allowed the Soviets to occupy all of Eastern Europe. Whether Patton's alternative would have produced better outcomes, or merely different disasters, remains one of history's most fascinating unanswered questions. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery, fueled by fuel shortages and personal ambition, stands as a stark reminder that even in total war, personality conflicts and political calculations can shape strategy as much as military necessity. Eisenhower's greatest achievement may not have been defeating Germany, but managing 2 of history's most difficult generals long enough to achieve victory, even if it took 7 months longer than either warrior believed necessary.